So as we're aware, pretty much every country in the world spends a lot of money building military power, and countries go to war, and one of the things you really don't want to have happen, right, is to have some other country attack you and you not have enough force to repel them. So force seems to be still a necessary tool in international politics. When all else fails, right, force is what things come down to. And so it's just a very powerful, important tool. But what I want to stress here is the things that you can't get done with force. So we get back to our Prussian military theorist Clausewitz again, this notion again that war is politics by other means. So one question to ask about the goals that states try to use force or the threat of force to achieve is this a goal that can be achieved by force? Right? Can you instill democracy by force? Can you win the hearts and minds of people by force? Can you create economic productivity by force? The answer probably in all three cases is that that's pretty hard, right? But for example, after the United States ejected the government of Saddam Hussein in Iraq in 2003, or when it ejected the Taliban government in Afghanistan in 2001, the U.S. was then in the position of trying to use a military occupation to set up a democracy in both of those countries. And in other circumstances, that might have worked. It seemed to work in Japan and Germany after World War II. But when there were a lot of actors in Iraq and Afghanistan that wanted nothing to do with democracy, it was hard to impose it by force. Similarly, in terms of winning the support of people so that they didn't support their friends and cousins who were killing American soldiers, you wanted to win hearts and minds. You wanted people to say, yeah, we like the Americans being here. Stop killing them. Hard to do that, right, when your primary way of convincing people of things was with guns and bullets. Similarly, economic productivity. Economic productivity relies on people working hard, on them being highly motivated, and so on. Can simply threats of force do that? Probably not. So force can do some things that nothing else can do, but it can't necessarily do everything. And again, getting back to this idea of rationality, unless you're simply trying to exterminate another actor or simply take something, force, when it's supporting a demand or a negotiation, requires that your adversary is sensitive to costs and that you understand their perception of costs quite clearly. I've already made this point. And that's often not the case, right? We often don't understand the people in other countries facing different pressures. We often seem not to understand them very well. So that, for example, while the U.S. was able to defeat Saddam Hussein on the battlefield twice, those battles took place because twice we failed to coerce him effectively. Was Saddam Hussein rational? I think a lot of people would say Saddam Hussein was irrational. We could debate that. But if he was irrational, right, then coercion probably was never going to work. Bargaining was probably never going to work. Or maybe he was rational, but not in a way U.S. leaders understood. So, was the use of force successful in Iraq? Well, yes and no, right? It was successful. It was not successful in convincing the Iraqis to do the government of Saddam Hussein, convincing them to do what we wanted to do without us waging an incredibly expensive war. That failed. Was it successful, in this case, in defeating the Iraqi army? Yes, that was successful. Was it then successful in rebuilding and getting Iraq to a place that the United States felt like it could easily just bring our forces home? Not so much. Right? So force was very effective at destroying the Iraqi army, not as effective at some other things. And again, just to harp on a question that I've harped on already, the endurance of costs. Right? Success requires that you perceive your own society's willingness to endure costs. And of course, there's many, many wars that are started by the states that eventually lose their enthusiasm. Ultimately, right, the reason Germany surrenders in World War I is their troops simply wouldn't fight anymore. They were tired, they were hungry, they were exhausted, they knew they couldn't win. But ultimately, that was it, is the troops simply wouldn't fight. The U.S. In Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, the troops were still willing to fight, but people at home said, we don't want to be doing this anymore. We don't want our kids getting killed over there. We don't want to be spending the billions of dollars. Right? Bring them home. Part of the problem about the decision to go to war is that war is so unpredictable. And so even if you're willing to endure certain costs to go to war, it is incredibly difficult to predict what the costs of war are going to be, because wars rarely turn out as expected. Famous line that I hear from my military friends is, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. Clausewitz, again, had this famous term he called the fog of war, which is once war starts, it's very hard to know what's going on to keep control. So even when you win, the consequences may not be what you expected, and the costs may be much higher than you think. So, just to give some examples, the high costs of war, even if you win. France in World War I was a winner, but it lost a huge percentage, probably as much as a fifth of certain birth years of young males, right? The sort of 20 to 23-year-olds in France of that generation, many of them were just killed. And France ended up that war not much stronger and having to do it again in another 30 years. I'm sorry, another 20 years. The Soviet Union in World War II. The Soviet Union benefited a lot from World War II in the sense that it got to take over Eastern Europe, but the cost was 20 million people killed or 25 million people killed, depending on who counts. Again, North Vietnam. Yep, they got the Americans out, but boy, the cost was very high. Same for the U.S. and Iraq. The U.S. Engagement in Iraq that began in 2003, the bills are still accumulating, but it's going to end up being in the several trillions of dollars. It's real money that could be spent on other things. So even when you win, right, war is really expensive. And when you lose, of course, it's much more expensive. Your country gets conquered. In the old day, back in classical times, your people would get sold into slavery and so on. That doesn't necessarily happen, but a lot of people can be killed. Others run your country, and so on. So force is incredibly powerful but costly. And strategy boils down to how you reduce your potential costs while raising those of your adversary. And if you're able to do that effectively, you might be able to get them to give in without war. But at least you want to get to the point where you're more likely to prevail if you do come to war. But again, back to our quotation from Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu would say, if you have to fight the war, you've already failed. Right? Because again, the whole point of force in diplomacy is to get what you want without fighting. Right? And so ideally, you should be able to win the war, but because you're able to win the war, you get what you want without fighting it. That would really be the goal, as Sun Tzu would have it. But it rarely seems to work that way.